Now, I think that there are certain psychedelics Deleuze calls the encounter. Deleuze views this thought process to be happening as a result of being in the world, of interacting with the world. And I think certain psychedelics, particularly I find something like LSD, causes you to take notice of things, of the world outside. You're not necessarily thinking, what is this, what am I doing, where are we going, what's the point of all of this? You're merely just interacting. So taking it back to the table, rather than seeing it as a table that functions as a table to put things on. If you're on something like LSD, you might just be exploring the grains in the wood and the patterns in the wood for 4 hours before you realise there's a table you've been staring at the whole time. So it's looking at this idea of an uninhibited thought process that's happening. How are we doing for time? So this encounter is a relationship which is constantly changing and constant flux. And again, suggesting this meditative method of an uninhibited interaction. The problem is that one has to be open to the idea of the encounter in order for one to have an encounter which is going to make them more open. And I think we see this paradox within the psychedelic experience. I think people would probably agree that the people who are kind of against psychedelics or see them in a negative light won't necessarily ever have a psychedelic experience or feel any openness because they are so reserved. So ultimately what people think as, I guess, revelations in the psychedelic experience could just be a rediscovering, and there might have been an inclining towards the psychedelic experience because something in the back of your mind might have said to you that the world's not necessarily how it seems and you might be curious. So it's problematic because if we are kind of going to actively make ourselves open to an experience such as a psychedelic experience, are we not then closing down the possibility for the actual uninhibited interaction? So this is where, we can find difficulties, but it might just be that by pure chance there are people that are open to this interaction. Quickly, I just want to talk about the idea of learning over knowledge. My supervisor wrote an interesting paper on Deleuze and swimming. He said that one learns to swim not by necessarily reading the manual of how to swim and then jumping in the water. Someone will get into the water and their interaction of their body against the body of the water allows them to swim, and they learn how to do this. There are obviously, the appropriate instructions put in place by the instructor. When you get in the water, do this with your arms, try not to drown, things like this. But for Deleuze, this knowledge shouldn't just stop there, and the learning process should continue. So we shouldn't just, in a philosophical sense, just have these ideas and talk about them as if everybody knows what we're talking about. And all these different philosophers that we kind of hold up high, and it all stops there. We should actually be continuing this process and not necessarily fixating ourselves with the great philosophers and what they've said, but actually prioritising learning over knowledge so we can continue to have these kind of uninhibited experiences. So really just to kind of conclude, I think that psychedelics or the psychedelic experience is quite powerful, particularly in a philosophical sense. People I find seem to get bogged down in language and just merely having conversations where they bring up a certain theory or a certain philosopher, and that kind of dictates the situation. And people might not necessarily feel comfortable with where you're going with the talk, so they might try and rein it back into the kind of field that they know about and the philosophy that they're comfortable with, and continue it along this kind of lineage and paint it in a certain way, in a certain image. And I think the psychedelic experience does a very good job of resisting this, of taking us out of these kind of traps, I think. I like to bring kind of essences of Taoism. I'm very fond of Taoism. And this idea of the kind of actively being passive and going with the flow, I think is quite important. It allows us to not become rigid, and if we're not rigid, then we can sense what's going on more. If we can sense what's going on more, then things won't surprise us, and we're able to understand the world in a different way. If things aren't surprising us, then we won't necessarily kind of feel disappointed or angry, and we can remain content. And I think, you know, there is, again, you know, a real problem with the psychedelic experience in that it can make us quite arrogant. I think, I mean, from personal experience, 5 years ago when I kind of first started getting into psychedelics, I became really arrogant, thought I figured out everything, the secrets of the universe and the mysteries of everything. And how could I have been so stupid as to not see these things before? And I think it's actually quite dangerous, and I think it can put people off just interacting with you or having a discussion with you. And we can feel as if we're in some sort of, you know, secret club where we know what's going on, or what Terence McKenna said, or whoever, and these people in suits have no idea. And I think in a personal sense, it doesn't actually allow you to resist anything. The countercultural movement just becomes an image of its own. And really, in order to resist everything, I think we need to aim to be comfortable with everything. Whether it's wearing a suit one day or wearing a shirt with, you know, flowers on the next day, it doesn't really matter. Everything is a kind of constant learning experience. And I think that, you know, we should actively try to do this as kind of paradoxical as it seems. I think I've probably spoken enough. It's early in the morning, we're probably very tired. And take some questions.
First of all, I think it's for you to bring the two together, Deleuze and what I see as also postmodernist thought, is a brilliant joining together of two ideas. What I would say, postmodernists continue, Thomas Kuhn, Derrida, Foucault, all talk about subverting dominant narratives. And what I think is what you might have touched on, which I think is really worthy of further exploration, is that narratives can get formed, even in the psychedelic. Let's say that there's a complete section of the psychedelic world, dominant narratives get formed. So, for example, Terence McKenna becomes the go-to man for a particular type of psychedelic experience. Challenging that is where I see resistance. The psychedelic experience allows you to, you know, get in touch with yourself, so that you then can feel what the true experience is. But narratives will continue to impose themselves. I think to explore the idea of challenging even that, because otherwise we fall into that same loop, as you said.
Remaining content and what do you think that is value in itself? I would like to remind the novel, the new brilliant book of Alex Huxley, where you mentioned that remaining content is one of the danger that is kind of highlighted in that book, and I don't think it's a value in itself.
From a personal perspective, I find that it is. I think being angry and unhappy is completely pointless, and you'll kill yourself. Trying to be happy all the time, I think, is very stressful and quite exhausting. And where are you trying to get to be happy? At what point do you stop and you say, okay, I'm happy, I've achieved these things, therefore I'm happy? And if you get to that point where you're happy, well, what's the point of living in it? What's the point of discovering? What's the point of having arguments or bad experiences or anything? Because you kind of crack it and you're happy. I think that we need to get away from this kind of be-all and end-all idea of happiness. For me, contentment is the idea that you're not necessarily in control of everything, and it's okay for things to be negative, and it's okay for things to be positive. To put a value judgment on it, of it being happy, or that thing being good, and therefore you're happy, I think it's quite dangerous, because then what territory are you stepping into? How do you know that that thing is going to make you happy for a long time? You know, what's to say you can become unhappy? So I think trying to aim for a goal of being content allows you, as I said, from my own kind of personal Taoist perspective, yin-yang philosophy of feeling the world and going with the flow, and understanding that it's okay, and trying to accept yourself and be content. And I think it is a very good value to aim for. But that is more kind of personal perspective of being very unhappy and being very happy, and finding contentment for me is kind of a good way forward.
So Oli, you mentioned that like resistance is important. It kind of comes from within the structure of resisting. It's not isolated from it. And yet the kind of structure that you're supposing we're trying to resist is the notion of kind of using language in everyday ways to categorize it. We want to get out of those shackles, but don't we inherently have to kind of communicate and like perform the resistance within that structure of using language to describe things? And that can be a problem for actually resisting without the means of maybe communicating.
I mean, I don't think that it necessarily has to happen with language. I mean, what Deleuze talks about is really the times when we are really thinking, with this image, or resisting, are the times when we kind of think that thought can possibly occur, or where language has no place. I mean, the amount of times you've been sitting at a computer trying to write something, and you're like, right, come on brain, write, and nothing happens, and then you go into the shower, and all of a sudden you get the eureka moment. So I think that this resistance doesn't have to happen through language, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a collective resistance in the way in which we think, resistance to the system. There's resistance in the mind, resistance to thought, resistance to not necessarily even your own thoughts, but the event of thought happening is a different way to go about it, a different process to engage with, where you're not actively trying to think, but thought happens because of this interaction, whether it's playing a musical instrument, painting a piece of art, eating a bit of cake, whatever.
Just back to the idea of resistance, it seems at some points you're advocating it as beneficial, and then you're also saying you practice Taoism. I'm just wondering, is that one of the paradoxes you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I personally accept the paradoxical nature of one doesn't necessarily have to resist against something, one can resist in something. So I can simultaneously be in a job that I absolutely hate, getting up every day 9 to 5. I think it's terrible, the physical actual system there that's grinding me down, but at the same time I can be in a meditative state, all the while where I'm making 300 calls to someone who wants to buy photocopies or whatever. I can be in this meditative state, and I can maintain my detachment from it. And I guess it kind of comes down to, not taking it all so seriously, not maybe thinking it's all necessarily real. If you can kind of entertain the fact that you're playing a game by getting up every morning and going to a job that you hate, then it kind of becomes a bit easier.
So would you see meditation as an act of resistance then?
Yeah. I would say meditation. I mean, all of these things which actively try to take you out of the normal processes by which you think, or the normal processes by which you think, then you're able to kind of get away from that, kind of stepping back. You constantly step back. You don't have to anchor yourself to benefit. Any other questions? No? Cool. All right, well, thank you guys.